Thanks a lot, Donna. I'll get straight into it. I thought it was a bit longer than it actually is, so hopefully I won't run over time. I look briefly at how the game has changed and focus really on these things here. Mostly the injuries, the latest interchange substitution data that we have, and the implications on game structure and so forth, and a couple of slides on the future. AFL, as I mentioned the other day, like most sports, has changed over time, and just very briefly, the rules were introduced and laid down 10 rules. I think the only thing that's pretty similar here is that the captains toss the coin before the game, but everything else has changed, and now we have 360 rules. But some of the things that might be of interest to some people involved in AFL, boundary throw-ins were introduced in the late 1800s, but something like coaches allowed on the ground were only in 1964. So coaches weren't allowed on the ground up until then. 2 field umpires in the late 70s and so on. So there's, and the first payments were allowed in 1930. There were £3 a game, but now we see sort of open-ended. That was a cap on what players could be paid. So we've changed a lot in many areas. In terms of the anthropometry or the physical dimensions, I've just got one slide, and that's just on height, and it's pretty obvious what it shows. Well, we found records at AFL House back to the early 1900s, and we know that the red line here shows the general population secular trend for height, and each generation is a little bit taller than the one before on average. But when we look at the 3 shortest listed AFL players, or VFL back here, and the 3 tallest, you can see that the game lends itself to people who are still shorter than average, but it looks like the tallest players are getting taller a bit faster than the general population. But overall, it's pretty close to the secular trend. So there hasn't been a huge change there, but it is quite difficult to find players now reaching nearly 7 feet tall. In terms of injuries, that's what I want to focus on. Injuries are it's difficult to go back in time to find really good records in the AFL/VFL. What we do know, these are published reports that I found in the scientific literature at different times for the highest level that was around at the time. So most of these are VFL. It seems that about 1990, again, some of this is from AFL Medical Officers Association here, and this is all from the AFL database. But what's pretty obvious here is that there seems to be it started quite low, if we can believe these data, and that's all we have. So I don't have any doubt there that it was lower. There was a rapid escalation here in the 90s when the game went fully professional, and players, I know in the early 90s at the Adelaide Crows, most of them had jobs and so on. So this is a period of time of professionalism within the game and full-time training and so on. And then we have another period where all clubs have been contributing over this time, so it's probably the most robust data, the best data that we have on injuries. And you can see that it's sort of gone down in the early part, the late part of the 90s, the early part of 2000s, and then has gone up from about the middle of this last decade. So this pattern doesn't happen by chance. There are things going on in here that I wanted to focus on, and the things that were going on in here led, and that's the most recent data, so we've had a number of years where it's been going up, and that has been so that red dot there is last year. Don't have any data from this year, obviously. This pattern of increasing injury rates over the last 6 or 7 years has led to some serious concerns about player welfare and what we might be able to do to the game to help mitigate the probability of injuries and long-term problems. This is a sort of a rough model that we published in 2001. I still think it has some validity. It's pretty sketchy, but basically, we thought that a central component back then, doing some early research in terms of contributing to injuries, was the speed of the game. And at that time, we couldn't measure player speeds very well. We used computer-based tracking, but we also used that same system for ball speed. So together, the general sort of speed that players and the ball was moving impacted injuries directly, or had the possibility of impacting injuries directly, but also via collisions. So just random collisions, accidents, or deliberate collisions may also have impacted collisions. But there are a lot of things that affected game speed. We found, for example, that hard grounds were generally led to faster games than softer grounds. You know, and they measured it in those days with penetrometer meters. But other things that we thought, you know, interchange rules back in 2001 might, and the types of umpiring decisions and so forth. So let's move on now to what do we know that about the associations between speed and injuries. I showed this graph the other day, and it shows from about 2002 3 things. It shows the blue line here is the play speed, which is the ball speed, has been going up. The player speed with GPS has been going up, and the injury incidence, as I showed just previously, has also been trending up. So whether they're causally related or not, we don't know for sure, but that pattern was enough to raise some level of concern. Now, when you add to that what we know, we didn't have GPS back here, but what we do have are measures of injury incidence, and we also have measures of ball speed. Now, when you add all those together, we have reasonably convincing evidence that they're trending down together and trending up together, plus the independent database of the GPS player speeds, then they tend to suggest there may be some causal link there. So these come from 3 independent databases. The player speed I'm involved with, sorry, the play speed I'm involved with, a separate database, and then the AFL medical officers database. So they all sort of trend in the same direction together.